Good evening, everyone. Sean Casten here from Illinois 6th. Proud to be joined by my friend and colleague, Marie Newman from the 3rd District, and Adam Jentleson, former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Majority Leader Reid, among other distinguished endeavors. Here to talk about the filibuster, a little bit about what's at stake, the history, and why I led a letter with 97 colleagues, including Congresswoman Newman, asking the Senate to end the filibuster. Lots to cover. We want to make sure to get to your questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll have a moderator going through and pulling those up as we get through. But without further ado, let me turn over to my friend Marie Newman to kick us off.
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. So our content for this evening will be truly fascinating because between the three of us, we bring three different perspectives, all in agreement, of course, but Adam Jentleson, his unique knowledge around the institutional information and kind of the historical perspective. So I think you're going to find this quite fascinating tonight. But broadly, the reason Sean and I decided to do this is that, interestingly, we learned that lots of Americans don't understand what the filibuster was and how it's been detrimental to making progress with regard to legislation and progress of the nation, quite frankly. So tonight's goal is to learn the historical and institutional perspective, a little bit about the rule that actually is the basis for it, which is just an arcane rule that's inside the Senate, and how we can change it each Senate. We'll talk a little bit about that. But interestingly, over half of America thinks that a bill is passed with 51 votes, a simple majority, if you will. And that is simply not the case. It takes 60. So part of the dilemma with the filibuster is that it is really hard to get to 60, really, really hard. So it's a bit of a wild goose chase every time either the Republicans or the Democrats try to get anything done in the Senate. And so really it doesn't benefit either side. And it is just a Senate to Senate rule and can be changed. So, and Adam will spend more time on that. But I just want to frame why it's critical that we reevaluate and get rid of this crazy rule, is that it has prevented background checks, universal background checks, which are approved by 90% of Americans. It might prevent the PRO Act, which is the right to organize fully. It might prevent things like HR 1, which is really, if nothing else happens, HR 1 has to happen. It will maintain our democracy, provide voting rights, create fair and free elections to a greater degree, accountability, and on, and really protect our democracy as we know it. So critically important. So those are just three of many bills that may not be able to go through if, in fact, we choose to keep the filibuster rule as it is today. So today we're going to go on a little journey around history and perspective, but I'm going to toss it over to Sean to share some of his perspectives on this as well.
Thank you, Marie. And I'm going to leave to Adam to go through the history of this, but I want to give a little, we can get, the challenge with talking about House and Senate procedure is you can get really bogged down in minutia that sounds like we're talking about something that most people have no familiarity with. And so I want to just offer a little bit of a perspective as an American. I'm an American who happens to be a member of Congress. Before that, I happened to be an entrepreneur. I happened to be an engineer. I happened to be a father, happened to be an occasional soccer coach, occasional piano player. But ultimately, all of us happen to be things, and we all happen to be Americans. And the truly unique thing that distinguishes America and has made us great through our history is that when we see things are broken, we fix them. It's the legacy of being a nation of immigrants that, you know, we were populated by people, at least those who came voluntarily, who didn't like the way their economic options, their religious options, and they got up, they moved, and they fixed it. Even the folks who came here involuntarily, the Great Migration to the North was people who didn't like their situation and were trying to fix it. Go West, young man was people who didn't like their situation and were trying to fix it. All that is built into the fabric of what it means to be an American. It was all deep within the DNA of our founders who created this. They didn't say we've got the perfect solution. They said we're going to create a constitution and make it amendable. And we amended it 27 times. They created the structure where every 2, 4, or 6 years, if you hold elected office, you might lose. And the only way that I get this job or Marie gets this job is the same way that Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi gets their job. If someone gets more votes than them next time, they get the job and they're out of luck. And they created this idea that we will use majority rule to solve hard problems. And the thing that amazes me in this line of work that I currently happen to have is that this crazy idea that our founders had actually worked. The idea that for 245 years, people have consented to be governed. They never said that we were gods. They never said that we were descended from kings. They just said, we're just going to take a bet that people will agree to do what the government tells us to do, because we expect that that government will continue to put public opinion first and will continue to put rule of law first. And we've survived for 245 years because while we've had our share of missteps, we have in generally done that more often than not. And that's not to say we don't have hard problems today, right? We've got hugely difficult problems. What are we going to do about the climate crisis? What are we going to do about the cost of healthcare, our immigration system, campaign finance, gun control, racial equity? These are all really, really hard problems. But our founders gave us the tools to fix them. And in fact, in the last Congress, in the House, we passed bills to address all of those problems. All those bills that we passed were passed on a bipartisan basis. All those bills that we passed, as Congresswoman Newman mentioned, were supported by overwhelming majorities of American people. And in order to pass them in the House, we debated them and crafted them in committee. The committee sent them to the floor. We got on the floor calendar. We debated them on the floor. Eventually, a majority of our members voted to stop debate on the floor. And then we voted them and passed them. And then we sent them over to the Senate, where exactly nothing happened. They didn't go to committees. They didn't get marked up. They didn't go to the floor. They didn't get debated. They didn't have people vote to end debate, and they didn't get passed and sent to the president because of the threat of the filibuster. And I will leave it to Adam to explain exactly how that works. But it's important to understand the cost of the filibuster is that we are not doing our job. The cost of the filibuster is we are not fulfilling what public opinion wants us to do. The cost of the filibuster is that we are holding the will of the majority hostage to the fickle desires of a very homogeneous minority. And that's a problem, but at the end of the day, we are Americans. And when something is broke, we fix it. And that's why we are making this push to end the filibuster. And with that, I turn it over to the distinguished and erudite Adam Jentleson.
Thank you, Representative Casten, and thank you, Representative Newman. It's such a great honor to be here with you tonight. I appreciate you hosting this event, and I appreciate your leadership on this issue, organizing the letter, speaking out, and driving this message that I believe is so important. And I'll just pick up where you left off, Representative Casten. I think you're absolutely right that the system was designed to be able to improve itself and to fix itself, and to allow people to make change within the system on a majority rule basis. And I don't think, I'm not an originalist. I would speculate that you all are probably not. There may not be many originalists on this call, and part of the challenge with the book was dealing with some things that the framers thought were not correct. But the system that they designed was supposed to be able to adapt and change. And what we're dealing with now is a system that is gridlocked and is unable to change and is unable to fix itself. And the reason that it is gridlocked and the reason that it is unable to fix itself is because of the filibuster. And I will try to run through 200 years of history here very quickly. But the point that I really want to drive home here is that I think when a lot of people think of the Senate, the first thing they think of is the filibuster. And I think it's something that is foundational to the Senate as an institution and something that was supposed to be there. And it wasn't. This is simply an open and shut case. The framers did not want the filibuster to exist. It wasn't that they didn't think of it. They thought about it. They contemplated whether they should put something like it in place, and they firmly rejected the idea of anything like it. And the reason that they did, and they were very clear about this at the time, was for exactly the reasons that Representative Casten was laying out, that they wanted the system to be able to change and adapt and to reflect the will of the people who lived in this country. So just to drill down real quick on this, the reason that we know that the framers didn't want the filibuster to exist is that they had something like the filibuster in the original draft of American government, the Articles of Confederation, which of course was the system of government that was in place during the Revolutionary War. In that system's version of Congress, there was a supermajority threshold for most major pieces of legislation. That was put in place for the same reasons that you hear defenders of the filibuster argue for it today, which was that they thought having a higher threshold, when I say supermajority, I mean more than a majority to pass things. In this case, it was 2/3. The thinking was that requiring 2/3 to pass big bills would promote consensus and compromise. It's sort of the intuitive approach to this. What they found was that in practice, it did the exact opposite, which was that it created gridlock and allowed the minority in any given debate to throw a monkey wrench into the system and cause the majority to fail and make them look bad out of political spite, basically. Obstruction is nothing new in American politics. The framers were very realistic about this, and they saw this happen before their very eyes in the Continental Congress. So when they devised the Constitution, they were extremely clear that they didn't want anything like this to happen again, that they didn't want to repeat the mistake. And so they created a system that was designed to have checks and balances, as we all know from civics class. They created a bicameral legislature with a Senate that was designed to be a check on the more rough and tumble House. No offense to the representatives. But the way that the checks and balances were supposed to operate had nothing to do with the filibuster. The Senate was a smaller chamber. Senators are elected to longer terms, 6 years as opposed to 2 years in the House. Only a third of the Senate is ever up for election at one time, as opposed to the entire House of Representatives, which is up for election every 2 years. Senators are responsive to a broader constituency, an entire state, as opposed to districts in the House, which are smaller. These were the sorts of things that were supposed to make the Senate a cooling influence on the process. It had nothing to do with the filibuster. The framers were very clear that every decision point in the Senate should remain majority rule. They deemed majority rule what James Madison called the Republican, small r, Republican principle. It was the core of their philosophy of government. And they wanted debate in the Senate to be limited. They didn't want it to be obstructionist. They thought that senators should be able to have their say, but when they'd had their say, the Senate should move on and bring bills up for a simple majority vote. So this is open and shut. They were very clear about this in the Federalist Papers. They were clear about this in their correspondence. They were clear about it in the Constitution, in the original Senate rules, and in practice of the Senate for the first half century of its existence, where obstruction was very rare and the Senate was majority rule. All through the golden age that we learn about in history class, the age of Webster, Calhoun, of the great compromises and the attempt to prevent the Civil War, all of those compromises passed in a Senate that was a majority rule body. The Missouri Compromise, for instance, squeaked by about 2 votes. If it had had to clear a supermajority threshold, it never would have passed. The filibuster, as we know it today, did not start to emerge until around the middle of the 19th century. The reason it started to emerge was there were certain people who were unhappy with how little power the minority in the Senate had. And the main interest driving this motivation to give the minority more power was the slaveholding class in the South, because they could see that left to the march of history, that slavery was going to be on its way out. And so Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who's sort of the godfather of the Confederacy, in the 1830s and 1840s, started to devise what would become known as the filibuster. Again, this was so new at the time that it didn't have a name. It didn't even acquire the name filibuster until after Calhoun had passed away. But what he started to create was what we would today call the filibuster. The name itself connotes negativity. It was derived from piracy. There was a lot of piracy going on off the Gulf Coast of America. This was a hot topic at the time. And the filibuster was taken from them. There's a Dutch word called Filibuster. I'm terrible at Dutch, so that's a butchering of the name, but it was an anglicization of that word for freebooter, essentially. So everything about it was negative. When it started to come into existence, people saw that it could be obstructive and damage the Senate. Calhoun mainly pioneered it to advance the cause of preserving slavery on behalf of the slaveholders who he represented, who were his constituency in the South. This was the dawn of the filibuster in the 1830s and the 1840s. Fast forward to the 20th century. Throughout the 19th century, the Senate continued to be a majority ruled body. When the filibuster was started to be pioneered by Calhoun, this was what we would think of as the talking filibuster, the Jimmy Stewart on the Senate floor, giving a long speech to delay a bill. There was still no ability to create a supermajority threshold. The best they could do was talk for a long time to delay a bill from coming up for a vote. So that was sort of, it was obnoxious. It was seen as obstructionist. But ultimately, when they stopped talking, the bill would come up for a simple majority vote. The filibuster didn't acquire the ability to raise the number of votes it takes to pass a bill in the Senate until the Jim Crow era in the first half of the 20th century. There was a rule that was introduced in 1917. It was intended as a tool to, the way the committee described it, a tool to terminate successful filibustering. This tool gave a supermajority of senators the ability to end a filibuster if it had gone on for too long. However, what happened was Southern senators, dead set on maintaining white supremacy, took that rule and started to turn it into a de facto supermajority threshold, but only applied it to civil rights bills. Now, when I say these senators were motivated by white supremacy, this is not speculation on my part. These were their exact words. This was not a time in history when they were shy about declaring that white supremacy was their motivation. The leader of this group was a senator named Richard Russell of Georgia, who was the leader of the Southern Bloc from the 1930s until the 1970s. He declared, and this is a direct quote, "Any Southern man worth a pinch of salt would give his all to maintain white supremacy." He was very clear that this was his primary motivation in public service. In 1949, he testified at a Senate Rules Committee hearing about the filibuster that the primary reason he wanted the filibuster to remain in place was to block civil rights bills. They were not shy about declaring their motivations at this time. And from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 until 1964, the only category of bills that were blocked by this new version of the filibuster with its supermajority threshold were civil rights bills. Every other category of legislation continued to pass or fail in the Senate on a majority rule basis. So the 60 vote threshold that we have today simply didn't exist for most of the Senate's existence, and then only started to exist in the early 20th century only for civil rights bills. Just to make a point here, and I'll try to fast forward to the end because I want to take everybody's questions and open up for discussion, but sometimes we think that there was some wisdom in this delay, that America maybe wasn't ready for civil rights. I mean, try telling that to the millions of Black Americans who were suffering under Jim Crow, and who were suffering under a wave of lynchings that was sweeping the country at that time. But just to be very clear, there's no truth to that argument whatsoever. The country was ready for civil rights decades before the civil rights bills first started passing in the late 1950s and 1960s. The Gallup polling organization was around in the 1930s. In 1937, it polled the American people on federal anti-lynching laws, which were passing the House of Representatives, coming over to the Senate, and being blocked by the filibuster. In 1937, Gallup found that 72% of the American people supported federal anti-lynching laws. In the 1940s, Gallup found that upwards of 60% of the American people supported federal anti-poll tax laws. But throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, laws to end lynching, to end poll taxes, and to end workplace discrimination were passing the House of Representatives, coming over to the Senate. They had the broad support of the American people, but they were blocked by the Senate filibuster. This was the main use of the filibuster for the entire first half of the 20th century. After 1964, when LBJ famously breaks for the first time breaks the Southern filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill and passes the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the filibuster stops being used only for civil rights bills. Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, it starts to be used on a bunch of different topics. It is not directly connected to segregation anymore. However, during this period, it continues to advantage conservative causes far more than liberal causes. The very nature of the filibuster is that it is a tool that makes it easier to stop things. By that nature, that means it advantages the conservative side of the ideological spectrum over the liberal side. Conservatives, of course, in William F. Buckley's famous phrase, are the party that stands before history yelling stop. If there's a tool that makes it easier to stop things, it's going to help them more than it helps the party that wants to pass progressive change. Studies have been done showing that the filibuster during this period was used to maintain corporate power over workers' rights, and was used twice as often to block by Republicans to block Democratic bills than by Democrats to block Republican bills. But even during this period, it is still not used very frequently. Its usage is somewhat rare. It is not until Senator McConnell becomes minority leader that the use of the filibuster explodes. Senator McConnell's key insight was that he could take President Obama, who came into office promising to fix our broken politics, use the filibuster to destroy Obama's core political appeal and implement gridlock across Washington. It was a very cynical insight, but the fact of the matter is that it worked. President Obama was able to get a lot done despite this, but it was painful, it was ugly, it was partisan, and McConnell used the filibuster to create a sense of gridlock and make the American people think that Washington was broken. That is what you see today. The reason that these bills that Representative Casten and Newman mentioned are passing the House, passing the House just like civil rights did, coming over to the Senate and being blocked, is a filibuster. It is a tool that intentionally creates gridlock. It was not meant to exist, and That is why there is an urgent need to reform it and get back to the way the Senate was supposed to be, a system that was supposed to be able to, as Representative Casten said, fix itself. That's the system the framers intended. That is what we need today, and that is what the goal of filibuster reform is. So I will stop there, turn it back over to you, Representative Casten, and love to hear folks' questions and open up for discussion.
Well, thank you very much. You got through that all without plugging your book. So I would just say, if you've not read this, folks, Kill Switch, Adam's book is fantastic. I just finished it last night, and it's a good explanation when you need more than 10 minutes of a summary of the book for the book report. I see a lot of comments starting to come in. Again, if you do have questions, please throw them in the chat, whether you're watching on Facebook or whatever other platforms we're on. And I believe Laura will start moderating and try to read these through, and we'll get through as many as we can before we run out of time.
Thank you, Rep. Casten. The first question is directed towards Adam. The filibuster has been an effective tool for both parties since 1806. So why should this be changed now? Didn't it used to be considered a stabilizing influence on legislative action?
It was never really considered a stabilizing influence. And it's, the parties have changed dramatically. Those white supremacists that I was discussing earlier were all Democrats during the Jim Crow era. So, it's, if you assign party affiliation to it, it has definitely been used equally by both parties. But the thing is, the parties have changed dramatically. If you assign an ideological tilt to it, it has been used far more by conservatives, regardless of what party they're in, to block things than it has been by liberals. So it is consistent in its the sense that it advantages the conservative side of the aisle over the progressive side of the aisle. That has always been the case. But it's never really been something that is seen particularly positively within the Senate. I think it's important to be clear about that. From the very beginning, when it was introduced, it was sort of treated with horror. And it wasn't 1806. 1806 is when a rule was changed that sort of created a loophole that allowed the filibuster to exist. But it wasn't until the 1830s and 1840s that it actually started to come into existence. And when it did, leading lights of the Senate were horrified at it. Henry Clay, who we consider one of the greatest senators of the era and the great compromiser, when John Calhoun started to introduce what would become known as the filibuster, Henry Clay reacted with horror and actually tried to immediately get rid of it as soon as it was introduced. For 200 years, there's been a bipartisan tradition of reformers that include some of the leading lights of the Senate who've never stopped trying to get rid of the filibuster, and in fact have reformed it many times over the decades. These are not just Democrats; these are Republicans. In 1891, there was a big filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill, and Nelson Aldrich, who was a Republican, who was the man who created the Federal Reserve. This is not a wild-eyed radical. His daughter married a Rockefeller. This was a pillar of the East Coast elite establishment. He tried to get rid of the filibuster to pass the Civil Rights Bill. He was joined by Henry Cabot Lodge, another pillar of the East Coast establishment, in trying to get rid of it. Dwight Eisenhower, as president, led an effort to get rid of the filibuster to pass a strong civil rights bill at a time when Republicans were making a more aggressive push on civil rights than Democrats were. Richard Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president at the time, was a moderate, and he joined in that effort. So there's a broad bipartisan history of trying to get rid of it. It's never been something that's been good for the institution. It is something that was associated with a decline in the institution from the moment it was introduced until now. And I think the idea that it's had a stabilizing effect is something that's largely a myth.
Thank you. Rep. Casten, I'm going to direct this question to you first. Removal, it seems as if the two parties aren't even interested in working together. Why is removing this filibuster necessary and not making an increased effort to reach across the aisle?
I guess I'd really encourage you not to see this as a partisan issue. And as tempting as that may be, all those bills that I described that we passed last term were bipartisan bills. We had good support on them. I got a number of bills that I led with strong bipartisan support that we ultimately got signed into law, but the bills that I got signed into law were the bills that could find loopholes to get around the filibuster. It wasn't that they weren't bipartisan, so the Clean Industrial Technology Act that David McKinley from West Virginia helped lead on that one. Susan Collins actually helped steer that one through the Senate. The Battery Energy Storage Act that we worked through with Lisa Murkowski in the Senate. Those bills got signed into law in a year-end omnibus must-pass bill that was essentially filibuster proof. But beyond that, do keep in mind that nobody elects someone to Congress so that they can represent the views of another member of Congress who represents a different state. right? Our measure of success isn't whether we make Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi happy. Our measure of success is, do we do what our constituents want? And when we passed the American Recovery Act, that's provided all of this support to folks and got people getting paychecks and getting back to work and getting vaccines rolled out. Overwhelming majority of Americans, Democratic, Independents, Republicans, support that bill. The fact that it didn't get any support across the aisle doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do. And I think you'd be rightfully upset if we didn't push to make sure that vaccine availability was out there, unless and until we got support across the aisle. So to come back to the question, the filibuster is a procedural problem that prevents bipartisan legislation or partisan legislation, but legislation that gets the support of the majority of the House of Representatives and is supported by the majority of the American people can't even come up for consideration unless it has the support of a minority of senators. And that's the problem. It's a structural problem, not a partisan problem.
Representative Casten, if you don't mind, I'd like to add something to that, which is that the idea that the filibuster encourages bipartisanship is another myth about it. It doesn't encourage bipartisanship. Its rise is associated with a rise in gridlock in the Senate and a decline in bipartisanship. The reason for that is that it creates an impossible standard. In today's Senate, requiring 60 votes to pass something is essentially setting a standard that's impossible to meet. Political scientists have studied this inside and out. That 60th vote, they call it the tipping point vote, has gotten so far to the right that it's an impossible standard to meet. If you look at the Senate today, you can't count 10 Republican senators who will come over and vote with Democrats on virtually anything that is of major import. By requiring 60 votes, which is an arbitrary standard, you're killing chances for bipartisanship. By contrast, if you required 50 votes to pass, there would be ample opportunity for Republican senators to come over and join with the Democrats. And I think you would see a much greater incidence of bipartisanship. There are many bills on which you can easily see a number of Republican moderate senators, some people like Susan Collins, Senator Murkowski, Senator Romney, coming over and joining with Democrats, where you could pick up 2, 3, 4 Republicans here and there. That would be a major bipartisan accomplishment in today's polarized era. But picking up 3 or 4 Republicans is realistic. Picking up 10 Republicans is simply unrealistic. And by requiring that standard, you are stifling any chance of bipartisan bills passing in the Senate.
I'm going to steal a line from your book, but you got that quote from Hamilton where he said that, Alexander Hamilton, that is, that what at first sight may seem a remedy is actually a poison, that requiring supermajorities to pass laws is effectively the same as saying we are going to grant the minority control. So it's exactly the opposite of what our founders intended, which is to say, you may or may not like who is in the majority, but we have this government where the will of the majority is the thing that sets the laws. And supermajorities are saying we're just going to decide that the will of the minority is what should set the laws. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, thank you. Direct the next question to Rep. Newman first. How can senators who are reluctant to eliminate the filibuster be convinced to change their minds?
Well, in this country, because we are a blend of a republic and a democracy, the grassroots are critically important, and the grassroots have to really let their voice be known. And I think we've gotten very good at that in the last 4 or 5 years, letting the House know, folks like Sean and I know what your districts want. We're largely in alignment with our districts. And then what's very important is to continue that with our senators. So as an example, universal background checks is a very bipartisan bill throughout the country. 90% of Americans, not Republicans or Democrats, but 90% of Americans agree, and 80% of NRA members agree that this should be, universal background checks should be passed. The problem is that we have something like 47 senators who don't agree for potentially other reasons that might be I won't be kind here, a little bit nefarious, that they're worried about their donors more than they are about their constituents. Another example is HR 1, our democracy bill, is approved by nearly 70% of the country. That means that there are some independents and Republicans in there. So that's a long way of saying that the grassroots needs to work harder and really speak to their senators, and not just their own senators, but all senators, to let folks know that, look, we are the majority. We are the majority of the nation. We are acting as the majority, and you should be listening to the majority of your voters who indeed want these things passed. Therefore, when we say that that I think it's 55 or 60% of the nation wants to get rid of the filibuster, listen to them. Let's change this arcane House rule and get it done. And then with regard to specific senators, call those senators night and day, email them, ask for Zoom meetings. Soon you can have in-person meetings, we hear, which will be great. But let them know how you feel. And the grassroots is the best way to do that. And it keeps our blend of a democracy and republic intact.
Thank you, Rep. Newman. I have another question for Adam. We also asked that questions be submitted in advance, and we received many comments from people concerned about the long-term impact of eliminating the filibuster. If Democrats were able and willing to do away with the filibuster today, is there a danger that Republicans would push through any restrictive bills they chose to with a slim majority? You know, what would happen when Democrats are in the minority?
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that's very important to take into consideration. I mean, look, there's sort of a philosophical answer to this, and then there's sort of a brass tacks political answer to it. So I'll try both. You know, the philosophical answer is that we live in a democracy, and we are supposed to have a system that is majority rule. And it's important to point out that we are the anomaly when you look at every other democracy in the world. It is unusual, to say the least, to have a 60-vote threshold, a supermajority threshold of any kind in your legislature. Every other modern democracy operates on a majority rule legislature. Every other state legislature within America has a majority rule legislature. So, you know, there's a reason for that, which is that creating a supermajority threshold within your legislature as a requirement for every bill to pass simply creates untenable levels of gridlock. And if our interest here is to save our democracy and to restore it to some level of functionality, I think that has to be our core goal. You know, what we have is a system where we have these bills that Representative Newman was just discussing that have broad bipartisan support out there in the country, but are unable to pass because of this filibuster and this obstructive tactic. So that is sort of the philosophical answer. You know, the higher order goal here is a functioning system, a system that is capable of responding to the challenges we face as a nation in a relatively timely and thoughtful fashion. Because if you don't have that, you're on the path to failure, to systemic failure in a democracy. And I think it's not hard to see where this country is you know, on a trajectory in that direction when it can't meet basic challenges. The brass tacks political answer, I would say, is that there are many things that will simply not pass if we don't get rid of the filibuster that are very important progressive priorities, things like HR 1, S1, things that are going to restore balance to our democracy. So if you're asking this from a perspective of, you know, will Democrats make it easier for Republicans to pass bad things, I think you have to look at the overall strategic balance. And by leaving the filibuster in place, Democrats would be in guaranteeing that some of these core goals do not pass up front. And then they basically be crossing their fingers and hoping that the filibuster stays in place when Republicans take over. I think what's important to note is that Republicans can get rid of the filibuster just as easily as Democrats can. And Senator McConnell has shown a willingness to do whatever is in his political interests at the time. He got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees in 2017 when it was to his advantage. So, you know, Democrats would choose to not pass core priorities now, and then they would cross their fingers and hope that Mitch McConnell lets them keep the filibuster when he's back in power. And I think that's probably a strategic miscalculation. So that would be my brass tacks political answer to that question.
If I could just add to the brass tacks, and maybe I'm naive and, you know, haven't been in this institution as long as you've been around it, Adam, but I think the gamble is if we got rid of the filibuster, we could pass laws that are supported by the overwhelming majority of the American people. We being all of us in Congress, regardless of our party. The question is, if we got rid of the filibuster, would people then force through legislation that is opposed by the majority of the American people? And if that's the case, we have a corrective, and the corrective is at the ballot box. But to me, regardless of what party is supporting it, if a party is bringing bills forward that are supported by the overwhelming majority of the American people, they should at least be able to come up for a vote in the Senate. Right? That seems a small thing to ask.
Yeah, if I could just, I'm sorry to piggyback on that. I mean, there's an accountability aspect here too, right? Which is that, let the bills come up for vote and let them pass. And there is a tendency for things to, when things are unpopular, it is hard for people to vote for them. You saw this with the Affordable Care Act, which Republicans for 7 years campaigned on, swore up and down that the first thing that they were going to do when they came into office was repeal the Affordable Care Act. They come into office, they do a repeal process through the reconciliation process, which is an end run around the filibuster that's able to be used narrowly for certain types of legislation. But it means you only need a majority to repeal it. So the filibuster was no help to Democrats in blocking repeal of the Affordable Care Act. But all of a sudden, the Affordable Care Act got very popular, and Republicans were unable to muster the votes on a simple majority basis to repeal it. So it is elected officials do not like to vote for things that are deeply unpopular, and reforming the Affordable Care Act was deeply unpopular. So I think but they campaigned for 7 years before they actually had to do it. So there's an accountability aspect to this too that I think is very important.
Thank you. My next question is directed first towards Rep. Casten. Are there other options being discussed that improve the use of the filibuster instead of straight out eliminating it?
So there are, although to be very clear, this is a debate about Senate rules, and none of us on this call get to vote on Senate rules. Two of us are in the House, and one of us is not elected. So the debate that may happen in the Senate about how to do this is something that we can influence because we have some relationships over there, but ultimately we won't be there. I would turn the question a little bit back to Adam because I think it's more of a philosophical question. The conversations that I have been privy to internally, there's been a lot of discussion around, should we go back to the talking filibuster? What's the pros and cons of that? There's been some discussion around what if there are particular types of bills, like, for example, the Voting Rights Act, to make sure that we don't have the ability to disenfranchise large groups of people, where it seems to be particularly problematic to say that we're going to allow a motivated minority to block the rights of the majority of the American people. And might we be able to craft something? Personally, I haven't heard any ideas there that don't make me a little bit nervous, because you end up trying to very precisely define language that gets away from the basic premise that says, exactly why are we deciding to be governed by a minority and an ostensibly majoritarian institution? So yes, there are discussions. I'm not, I guess I'm not in a position to handicap how likely those discussions are to go forward, and if they did succeed, whether they would actually accomplish what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and so I think there's sort of two categories of options that are being discussed. One is sort of a carve out to this reconciliation process that I mentioned before, which is sort of an avenue that allows things to pass on a majority vote basis that would expand. The problem with reconciliation is it's very narrowly defined in terms of what bills can go through it. And that narrow definition excludes things like voting rights, civil rights, gun control. So one category is thinking of expanding the reconciliation process. Some people call it carve outs to, create new exceptions and things that are able to pass through that would perhaps cover things like civil rights. The other category is a return to the talking filibuster, as Representative Casten alluded to. This would sort of try to restore sort of the purpose of the filibuster to the extent that it had any productive purpose. It was supposed to give the minority a say, the ability to come to the floor and have their say on any given issue, and maybe attempt to persuade people to come around to their side. Back in the day when there was actual debate in the Senate. So, the idea behind that reform would be to try to relink the filibuster. This link between the use of the filibuster and actual debate has been completely severed. When someone uses the filibuster, technically what they are doing is they are claiming their right to continue debating a bill. Of course, it is a procedural vote. It's not the final vote. And so, they're claiming this right that is bestowed on the minority in the Senate. But of course, nobody ever actually uses it right now. So returning to the talking filibuster would be to try to reestablish that link between the filibuster and debate in the Senate, so that if you were going to claim the minority's right to continue debating it, you actually had to go to the floor and debate it. The downside to that is that this talking filibuster was still very effective in blocking things. It is what was used to block civil rights for about 87 years. The threat is when it's not just one person doing it, but a bunch of people who get together and coordinate and are able to sort of keep it going indefinitely. So you'd probably need something like a majority vote backup to end that debate after a certain period of time. But those are the two categories of reform that are being discussed. I think many would argue that, in particular, the talking filibuster could be considered a restoration, going back to the traditions of the filibuster, going back to the idea that there should be some debate associated with it, not just people sending an email to their leaders and saying, I'm going to filibuster, and that email alone raises it to 60 votes without that person who sent the email or their senator have to actually come and debate on the floor.
Thank you. We had a number of participants ask what happens if we do not end the filibuster. So I wanted to allow both Rep. Newman and Rep. Casten to kind of address the specific legislation that their constituents would like to see passed that is being held up right now.
I'll go ahead and take the first shot at that. I know that the PRO Act, which would guarantee organizing rights throughout the nation and freedom to negotiate and collective bargaining and a number of things without fear of bullying or taking away rights. So that bill is incredibly important, particularly in this day and age when in the last many years, workers' rights have been dramatically reduced and beaten up and trampled on. The NLRB and the NLRA have been completely trampled on and decomposed. So restoring all of that is incredibly important, and that would be very important to my district. But I also think that it has large acceptability and approval throughout the nation to the tune of 60%, something like that. So again, it's one of those where very important in my district, but clearly to more than half of Americans. So in the spirit of our majoritarian model of a blend of a democracy and a republic, we should be allowed to pass that. And would be very important to my district. But because of the filibuster as it is today, it will not. And, you know, here's the interesting thing, and I think both Sean and Adam both touch on this. At its heart, America are entrepreneurs and innovators and visionaries. This is the only and first time that this type of a blend of a democracy and a republic has worked in the world. So the fact to say that we can't, or someone might say that we can't figure this out, it's only this model or this model. You know, I've got news for everybody that every law starts from scratch. So the rules that govern the Senate might need to start from scratch in terms of how we look at this. Maybe it's not a talking filibuster and it's not a full filibuster. It's another debate structured model that allows us to talk to one another that we're not thinking about right now. So I challenge all of the amazing 100 folks that have been elected to the Senate to think more innovatively and think like Americans, think in a visionary and entrepreneurial fashion. What can this rule be given we are a 21st century society and a 21st century economy? So let's not think inside the box, let's think outside the box.
So I want to touch on two huge issues. The first is civil rights and the second is climate change. We should not lose sight of the fact that in the last really 15 years, we have had major court decisions that have completely changed the whole structure of voting integrity in this country. The Shelby versus Holder decision that undid the civil rights, for practical purposes, undid the bulk of the Voting Rights Act of 1964. Correct me if I got that wrong, 65. And we immediately saw a huge surge in minority voter disenfranchisement as a direct result in those states that had formerly had federal oversight of elections. There was in the most recent election, 2020, if you were a white person in America, your average wait to vote was 6 minutes or less. If you were a black person in America, your average wait to vote was 54 minutes. That was in the most recent election. And that's a direct result of that. Well, the Voting Rights Act that we're trying, the update to that, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, is very intentionally designed because we know that that's happening. We know that there are states now trying to make it harder and harder for minorities to vote. And we know that because of the laws as they sit right now, there's going to be litigation. And when it gets to the Supreme Court, as it probably will, we want to make sure that we reaffirm that we are committed to the idea that every American should have equal access to vote. And that means restoring those rights. So that's HR 4, and that's to a related, somewhat different degree, HR 1. The Citizens United decision, the huge unleash of money in politics, that's partially gets addressed by HR 1. we have to pass those things to get changed. So broad issues of civil and voting rights, gerrymandering are all tied up in that. The climate issue I want to touch on, it's important to understand that issues we think of as partisan today were not partisan in recent memory. When the Nixon administration created the EPA, the first head of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus, created, when he became then the sixth head of the EPA under Ronald Reagan, worked with his protege, Bill Riley, who became the head of the EPA under George W. Bush, to create the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol was this idea that we have a global pollutant. We need to come up with a globally binding treaty that will bind the US to all other nations to reduce this pollution by putting a price on pollution and creating a market that will buy and sell that. That was led by two Republican administrators under the Reagan, Bush, and formerly Nixon White Houses. And it passed the Senate 83-6. Now, the pollutant in that case was chlorofluorocarbons. It was related to the ozone hole, and the ozone hole was subsequently closed. That was, Montreal Protocol was, help me out, Adam. I want to say 83, 84-ish. It was in that vicinity of time, within my memory. Fast forward about 10 years, Waxman-Markey, which was attempting to do the same thing, but for CO2, create a market for pollution, craft it through. In your old boss, Harry Reid's famous word, it's easy to count to 60 and we can't get to 60. And so we didn't pass that. And almost half of all the CO2 we've emitted as a species has been since we didn't pass that bill. It's actually 1985, but darn close to it. And so now we're sitting here saying, okay, we have this huge, urgent need to address the climate crisis. We have structural rules which are based on ideas that were the domain of the Republican Party. They were good ideas, right? They were, let's put a price on pollution. We simply can't get that through right now without the filibuster. And so we are condemning our children and grandchildren to higher sea levels, to greater wildfires, not because we don't have technological solutions, not because we don't have policy solutions that were created on a bipartisan basis, but because of the filibuster.
I would just add to that opposition to the filibuster itself has been bipartisan historically. And this is another one of the issues that like the ones you've raised, that has only become partisan very recently. Even in 2005, President George W. Bush was trying to get rid of the filibuster. Senator McConnell was the second ranking Senate Republican leader at the time, and he led the floor fight to get rid of the filibuster in 2005. So, it is, and, I mentioned before, President Eisenhower was a fascinating episode in his administration. He and his Vice President Nixon teamed up against Lyndon Johnson and Senate Democrats to try to get rid of the filibuster with a bipartisan coalition behind them. So, the idea of reforming our government so that it can be responsive in a timely fashion and make responsible policies like the ones Representative Casten just laid out, that is something that used to be a bipartisan value, and we've lost that with the polarized environment that we have today. But it should be a bipartisan value. What we're talking about here is functioning government, going back to the way the framers intended it to be, and passing reasonable, moderate solutions in a relatively timely fashion. That's really the principle that's at stake.
Thank you. Alex is directing this question to you, Adam. What is your best argument for ending or amending the filibuster? In your eyes, does the filibuster have any place in future politics?
I think that it has a place insofar as the Senate should always be a place where the minority is able to have their say on any given issue. As Reps Casten and Newman know all too well, when you're in the minority, you're lucky if you get an hour of debate as for the entire 200 odd members of the minority on a given topic on the Senate floor. So that's the way the House was designed to be, and that's it's 435 members in the chamber that you have to have those kind of rules for it to function. In the Senate, there should be a place for the minority to be able to have their say, and in an extended period of time. I don't mean an hour or two. I think a week, a couple of weeks. There should be the ability to go to the floor to say what they want to say, to try to persuade people to come over to their side. I think that's critically important. The issue for me is when efforts at persuasion shift into efforts at obstruction. And that's where the filibuster, I think, needs to be reformed. Previously, for the last 200 years, as we've covered in this call, the filibuster was virtually incapable of stopping things until this supermajority threshold started to be applied to civil rights in the Jim Crow era. Going back to a system where if you wanted to debate, you had to come to the floor and use that debate, I think would be productive. I still think that has to be backed up by the ability of the majority to cut off that debate after a reasonable period of time has passed. That to me is the type of reform I would like to see. The argument for getting rid of it, as the questioner asked, is simply that the Senate is going to become just another failed institution in American life if it continues to be incapable of responding to the challenges that we face in a relatively thoughtful and relatively timely fashion. That's just where it's headed. We don't lack for common sense bipartisan solutions today. We have common sense bipartisan solutions to climate change, to gun control, to income inequality, to any number of things, to immigration. What we lack is a functioning system that can process these changes. That's what the Senate was supposed to be. Right now, it has become the clog in the artery that stops those common sense solutions from passing. We have to get back to a system that functions. That's in the interests of all of us as Americans, not just Republicans, not just Democrats, but to have a functioning system instead of dysfunction, I think should be a bipartisan value.
Thank you. Rep. Newman, Timothy is wondering why you and Representative Casten are hosting this webinar on the filibuster when this is an issue facing the United States Senate.
Well, great question. The reason that we decided to do this, and many members of the House across the nation are doing during this week, is talking about the filibuster to their constituents to help them educate, because many people don't understand what the filibuster is and how it is detrimental to passing laws. A full 62% of the nation would like to see us pass more laws faster and in a bipartisan way, right? So what is the best way to do that is to discuss the filibuster, discuss how we can move on from it and progress into the next form and create a new rule. Going back to what I said before, is let's create a new rule that is more flexible and appropriate for a 21st century society and economy. So when Sean and I talked about this, the idea was let's educate a little, let's bring an expert like Adam in, who's been wonderful tonight, and talk about it from both of our perspectives so that people can decide for themselves, hey, does this arcane rule still work? Does it not work? Am I undecided? But this at least gives people the information that they need. And we thought it was critically important.
Thank you. My next question is for Rep. Casten. Do you think it will end up being a particular issue that will force Congress to deal with the filibuster once and for all, like gun control, DC statehood, voting rights, climate change?
It's a good question. I suppose one could conceive of an issue that was so big and the vote was so egregious that, it mobilized people to act on it. I guess I can imagine any number of issues where that could happen, but getting to that point in all cases scares me. If we have to depend on the Senate changing what, let's be honest, is kind of an obscure and complicated parliamentary rule because there's madness in the streets, like we've already failed 15 prior tests. So yes, I can imagine that might happen, but I sure hope we will address this proactively rather than reactively.
Thanks. Adam, we're getting a number of questions asking you to kind of explain the process for killing the filibuster.
Absolutely. So the process for getting rid of the filibuster is actually relatively simple. It only requires a majority vote to do this. It is sort of hyperbolically referred to sometimes as the nuclear option. This is a procedure that has been used many times by both parties. Senate rules were designed to reflect the will of a majority of its members. And so the sort of superseding principle in Senate parliamentary procedure is the idea that when a majority decides that it wants to alter its rules in a certain way, the body should reflect that alteration. And so at any point, the Senate would simply go through a series of votes at a majority rule basis that would change the rules. If you want to get into the weeds about technically what they would do is you sort of ask the parliamentarian or you ask the presiding officer for a ruling on, what do the current rules say? And the presiding officer would basically read back that current rules say that it currently requires 60 votes to end debate and move to a majority vote on the bill. And then the Senate would vote as a body with a majority vote behind it to say that is no longer the rule. The rule is now that it takes, whatever their reform would be, that you have to hold the floor in order to delay a vote on a bill, that you have to vote on a majority basis. So it's a relatively simple procedure. You can, that is the procedure by which you implement the change. The change can be written really in any way that senators want. Again, the Senate is supposed to be an evolving body. It's supposed to change. And so if senators decide that they want to elevate it to 80 votes, they can do that. If they want to set it down at 15, they can do that too. I don't think that's a good idea, obviously. But the point is that it was supposed to be not this sort of paralyzed institution we know today, but it was supposed to be an institution capable of evolving and changing. And so it's that majority vote basis that allows you to do that.
Thank you. And thank you all for taking the time to answer all these questions. I'd like to now invite you to make your final comments, starting with you, Rep. Newman.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our wonderful guest tonight, Adam Jentleson. He has been so articulate on kind of the finite reasons why we are where we are today and possible solutions. And I also want to thank all of our attendants tonight, participants, because you took time out of your day to learn a little something and to hear people's perspectives. And that's critically important as part of our democratic process. So thank you to the audience for being here, and so pleased as always to work with my friend and district neighbor to the west, Sean Casten. And with that, I'll toss it over to Sean.
Well, thank you, Marie. What I love about this job is that you get to connect and have a two-way conversation, and seeing the number of people who have participated, seeing the number of comments that have come in. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but thank you for engaging. This whole, as I said, this whole beautiful 245-year experiment depends on folks continuing to show up and participate. So thank you for participating. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. Thank you, Marie, for helping to set this up, and thank you, Adam, for all your wisdom and education. I've just learned a ton, and really appreciate it. So thank you all. And Adam, we'll leave the last word to you.
Well, I would say it's been a pleasure to be here, and I would thank you, Representative Newman and Representative Casten, for hosting this. I think it is truly a service and a civics lesson. Hopefully, folks got something out of it. Thank you for folks out there who participated. The engagement is what makes this country function. My last reflection on the topic is simply that this is a question of can our democracy continue to function in a reasonably responsive fashion. Things that are going to pass under this scenario are not going to be radical left policies or radical right policies. The checks and balances the framers put in place still exist. If you remove the filibuster from our system, we still have more checks and balances in our system of government than any other modern democracy. The filibuster is the thing that tilts us from a reasonable amount of protections for minority into dysfunction. So I would just encourage people to think of it in that way. In this political environment, everything gets politicized, everything gets polarized. But this is really a question of functionality and responsiveness over dysfunction. And I think that is something that everybody should be able to agree upon.
Good night, everybody, and thank you so much for coming.
Thanks all.